Stacey, what type of benchmarking does the report do? I mean, does it in any way explain which is the best city to live in, I guess, in terms of those resources, in terms of the integration of different races, cultures, etc.?
Well, it doesn't indicate which is the best city to live in. But what it does do is it shows in what areas each city is faring better. So it shows across, we've got 4 themes that the report deals with. It looks at how inclusive cities are. It looks at how sustainable cities are. We look at the productivity within cities, the extent to which the economy has been inclusive, the extent to which cities have been able to begin to invest in areas that have not traditionally been seen as economically attractive. And often the point is made that what we're trying to do is trying to encourage business to begin to look at areas like townships. Gauteng cities have a big focus, for example, on township economies. How we look at areas, those kinds of areas, and think about the kinds of innovative investments that work in those spaces, because they haven't traditionally been shaped and developed to attract investment. So how do you think around the informal? How do you think about including that component? How do you think about the kinds of planning, the kinds of incentives that will allow business to invest in those kinds of areas? So it looks at that, and then also it looks at how cities are governed. So across the 9 cities that we look at, the 8 metros, and Umsunduzi as the additional city, it looks across those different themes, and it says, well, how is each one faring in each one of those areas? So obviously some cities are faring a little bit better than others in terms of perhaps inclusivity, in terms of perhaps the productive angle. It also looks at how cities have been managing their finances, and is informed by the State of Cities Finance report that we did last year, that looks at where cities have improved, audit findings, how they've managed to get alternative kind of financing. Because one of the points that is often made is that cities are not sufficiently financed for the kind of expectations that we have of them to transform, to change, to include everybody. So it looks across the 9 cities at all of those components. So like I said, it's very difficult to say it's better to live in one city compared to another, and I don't think that's what we're trying to do. It's not about pitting cities against each other, but saying how do we learn from what is working in one city to the next. And that's part of what Cities Network does, is that we create platforms for city officials and people, stakeholders that are involved within city making, to learn, to benchmark, to innovate, and how do they share those kinds of lessons amongst each other.
Stacey, the spatial inefficiency, which you've mentioned, obviously, that is covered in the report, because of the legacy of apartheid and distances, for example, that workers need to travel, is obviously negatively affecting economic growth. And that is a huge challenge. How do cities overcome that?
So what the report actually does is to use spatial transformation as a lens to look at the themes I've just mentioned. And what we're saying is that we can't think about the transformation of space as a once-off issue. There's obviously short-term, immediate interventions. We have to be able to get people closer to where opportunities are. However, in the long term, we need to think about where people are located. We can't just reinforce the distances, the inefficiencies in how space is managed. So we need to think that there's both short-term but also long-term interventions. And what you do in the short term obviously has major implications for your long-term sort of spatial transformation. So the kinds of public transport investments we make now, for example, are absolutely essential, because we have to start beginning to think beyond just the car. I think we often recognize that there's a lot of aspirations within our cities, and as soon as people are able to, they move into a private car. But increasingly, we need to make the point that public transport in all the cities around the world, public transport is the backbone of a well-functioning city. And so where our resources and investments go needs to, for example, go into public transport. But it also says that land is a conversation we need to have. I mean, we all know in South Africa, if we don't have a conversation about land, how it's used, how we develop it, how we make sure that it is more inclusive. It's not just about land ownership, but about how we develop open spaces, how we ensure that those are inclusive and integrated. It's about planning the city. It's about where we're locating, for example, subsidized housing, affordable rentals in cities. And so the Spatial Transformation chapter tries to make the links across those various components: mobility and public transport, spatial planning and land, shelter and human settlements, and saying there are things that people require now. We need to think about how vulnerable people are when they don't have access to many areas of the city. They don't have access to shelter. They don't have access to spaces that make them feel and where they are able to contribute to the city. Yes, that's important now. However, if, for example, in terms of a subsidized housing program, we continue to build those on the outskirts of the city, we are not actually thinking long-term what that means about where people are located.
Stacey, final question. So often we pit Cape Town against Johannesburg, and when we discuss cities and metros, how are the other, I guess, coastal metros, how have they fared? Your Port Elizabeth, East London, Durban, etc.
So that's actually a good question, Nick. A lot of the smaller cities, we've even found that when we try and look across the board at, for example, the issue of public transport, the experience is varied. So a lot of the smaller cities have tried to make investments in public transport, but something, for example, like a bus rapid transit system wouldn't work in those smaller cities because of the densities, the number of people, etc. And there's also been a lot of governance challenges in those cities. I mean, we recognize that around governance, around planning, it's often about the capacity and the capability, the ability to draw people with capacity to smaller cities. But there have been some improvements, and again, that's what we try and do at the Cities Network, is about bringing people together, because even as a smaller city, to be able to learn from Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, Tshwane, Kuruleni, about their experiences in terms of public transport, how they've dealt with planning, how they've dealt with human settlements, is absolutely crucial. So they're not perhaps doing as well as some of the bigger cities, and we highlight where those challenges are and what are some of the potentials for improving those.